The screen door creaked behind me, but neither of them turned. I stood there still in my gardening gloves, the envelope softening in my hand from the sweat. "Just send her to Aunt Ruth's," Weston said, like it was nothing more than rearranging furniture. "This house is ours now." Renee let out a laugh, small, clipped, satisfied. "I was thinking we could knock out that back wall. Get more light in the kitchen. They didn't see me. Or maybe they stopped looking." I stepped back onto the porch, slowly. The stairs creaked louder than I wanted them to, but they didn't hear. They were busy planning a life that no longer included me. I walked toward the shed, away from the voices. Toward the field my husband and I used to mow together every second Sunday. I'd meant to pick basil for dinner. Instead, I stood there under the awning, pulling off my gloves one finger at a time. The letter was from the county. Property tax due. Name on the front, Ardith Lane. Not Renee. Not Weston. Just me. I tore it open with the corner of my nail. Second notice. I'd paid the last bill myself, just like always. So why had they sent this one here? Now I sat on the edge of the porch and let the late afternoon light settle against my knees. My son's voice was still echoing in the kitchen, even though the words had already done their damage. The wind shifted. I caught the smell of paint, something new being covered up inside. I folded the tax letter and slid it into my pocket. Then I stood, brushed the dirt from my palms, and walked inside without a word. The living room was quiet. The framed photos had been moved from the shelf to a box on the floor. Mine, all of them. I didn't ask why. Instead, I walked up the stairs to my bedroom, or what used to be. I heard the drawers opening before I reached the top of the stairs. Renee was kneeling by the cedar chest, folding one of my quilts. Green patchwork hand-stitched the winter after Weston was born. The plastic bin beside her was already half full. "No offense," she said without looking up, "but we need space for the nursery." I nodded, though she didn't wait for a reply. She reached for the stack of photo albums next. I stepped forward and took them gently from her hands. "I'll hold on to these," I said. Weston was downstairs in the living room, piecing together the crib. I could hear the soft click of wooden parts locking into place, the occasional thud of a mallet. I carried the albums into the hall, then turned back and stared at the box. The label read, "Upstairs Closet." Not Mom's things, not Ardith's quilts, just a location, a place to stash what no longer matched the walls. I knelt and adjusted the edge of one folded blanket so it lay smooth. Then I closed the lid. Renee stood and stretched. "We'll get a new dresser in here, something white maybe." I saw one online with gold handles. Very clean. My dresser was already gone. I hadn't even heard them take it out. "That chair by the window," she asked, pointing. "Would it be okay to move it to the garage for now?" It was Harold's chair, the one he sat in every evening with the crossword and tea. I didn't answer. I just walked over and placed my hand on the armrest. Renee shrugged. "Whatever works." She stepped out, phone in hand, murmuring something about crib sheets and baby monitors. I stood there for a while, one hand still resting on worn oak, then turned and left the room. Downstairs, Weston was adjusting the crib slats. He didn't look up when I passed. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and set the albums gently beside me on the table. Then I opened the laptop and typed in county property records. The screen glowed pale blue against the kitchen wall. My name was there, tucked neatly into the line marked previous owner. 7 months ago, I'd sat at this very table signing that quitclaim deed. Weston had said it was only to help them qualify for a better loan rate. "It'll stay in the family, Mom, just paperwork." Renee had smiled beside him, her hand resting protectively on her small belly already showing. I'd believed them. Now the county record showed a different truth: Renee and Weston Lane, sole owners. My signature sat where it always had, but the date filed was new. months newer. Someone had submitted a second version. I leaned closer. The notary's name wasn't familiar. The stamp looked blurry on the scan like it had been copied from something else. I printed the page, the whir of the machine steady and sharp, almost louder than the air in the house. Outside, I could hear them talking. Renee was showing Weston color palettes on her phone, her voice floating down the hall. We should go lighter in the hallway, makes it feel bigger. I folded the paper and slipped it into a folder that already held my birth certificate, Harold's death notice, and the original mortgage contract. Then I opened the bottom drawer of the old hutch and pulled out the small box where Harold kept his business cards and pens. Inside was a single card from the notary he'd used for every transaction the last 20 years. Martha Keene, retired now, but still in town. I found her number scribbled on the back in his handwriting. The ink had faded, but I could still read it. When she answered, her voice was older, but steady. Ardith Lane. It's been a long time. I need your eyes, I said quietly. And your memory. There was a pause, then a calm reply. Bring what you've got. I hung up and slipped the folder into my bag. By the time I reached the door, Weston was asking Renee about curtain rods. Neither of them looked up as I left. Renee appeared in the doorway holding a folder of paint samples, the kind realtors use when they're trying to make something look neutral enough to sell. I was thinking light taupe for the guest room, she said, flipping through the pages. It'll be your space until we can set something up with Ruth. I looked around. My dresser was gone. My books had been packed into boxes stacked by the wall. The floral quilt that had covered my bed for years was folded at the foot of a narrow twin mattress. Looks good, I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. Renee smiled politely. I'll order curtains once the paint's dry. Weston said you probably won't need much storage, right? I nodded again, because arguing felt smaller than the room itself. She kept talking about paint fabric things that had nothing to do with me, and I let her. When she left, I opened the closet. Inside was a single folding chair and an empty hanger bar. The faint outline of dust showed where my shoes used to sit. I ran my fingers along the wall, feeling the small dents Harold had made when he'd helped Weston hang shelves for his trophies. That was the summer he turned 13, the year he decided he wanted a room that felt more grown up. I'd spent a week repainting these walls myself, sanding them smooth after he changed his mind about the color halfway through. Now, the shelves were gone. So was the color. Downstairs, I heard the sound of a hammer. Weston finishing the crib assembly. A baby's mobile tinkled somewhere in the background. I sat on the edge of the twin bed and studied the new view from the window. The oak tree out back had lost its top branch in last winter's storm. Harold used to climb that ladder every spring to prune it, muttering that trees needed care or they'd take over everything. I stayed there until the light shifted, then stood and gathered the folder I'd left on the dresser. The next morning, I took it with me to the county office. The clerk at the county records office wore reading glasses that sat low on her nose. She tapped a few keys, leaned forward, and squinted at the scanned image on her monitor. This is the one, she asked, tilting the screen so I could see. The quitclaim deed. My name in black ink, their names in blue. And a notary stamp in the corner just barely legible. I nodded. Can you confirm when it was notarized? She tapped again. Says it was filed 3 months ago. But that stamp? She leaned in. This notary's license expired last year. She checked the date again. Yep. They'd already been removed from the state registry by the time this was submitted. She sat back in her chair, lips tightening. If you didn't authorize this, you may want to speak with legal counsel. I thanked her and walked out with a copy of the filing, the official rejection of trust, pressing cool against my chest through the envelope. The air outside felt heavier than the sky. I drove home without the radio. The dashboard ticked with every turn. That night I pulled out my old address book and found the name I hadn't thought of in years, Laurel Hines. We'd met when I landscaped her yard after Harold passed. She was kind, efficient, and sharp in a way that made people careful around her. She answered on the second ring. "Laurel, this is Ardith Lane." A pause, then a familiar warmth. "Well, there's a name I haven't heard in a while." "You keeping those apple trees alive? I need help," I said. "Legal." Another pause. "Come by tomorrow morning. Bring everything." I packed the folder. The printed records. The original documents Harold and I had filed when we first bought the land. Even the photos of the front porch being built of Weston in the yard with a hammer too big for his hand. The next morning, I arrived early. Laurel's office was tucked behind a florist, quiet and small. She was waiting with coffee already poured. The letter came on a Thursday morning, delivered with the rest of the mail. Weston brought it in, thumbed through the stack, then paused at the envelope with the typed label. Renee took one look at the sender, Laurel's firm, and snatched it from his hands. She tore it open right there in the hallway. The paper crackled as she read. Then her voice, sharp and rising, cut through the stillness. "What is this?" she snapped. "Fraudulent transfer reversal in progress." Weston took the letter from her, read it silently, jaw tightening as he skimmed the words. I was at the kitchen table, tea still warm in front of me. Renee spun toward me, cheeks flushed. "You're sabotaging your own son." I met her eyes. "I'm keeping the land I paid for." She scoffed. "You gave it to us." "I loaned it for a signature, not a takeover." Weston said nothing. He folded the letter once, twice, then dropped it on the counter like it had burned his hands. They both left the room. I heard the door to their bedroom close. A moment later, muffled voices began the start of a storm I'd felt coming for months. I didn't move. I let the tea steep longer than it should have. The bitterness suited the day. Through the closed door, I caught fragments. Renee accusing, Weston defending. Then silence. Then another wave. It went on like that until nearly midnight. At one point, someone slammed a drawer. I sat in the guest room with the lamp on low pen in hand, journal open. But I didn't write a word. There was nothing in their fight that needed to be recorded. I already knew the ending. Just before sleep, I heard Weston walk down the hall and open the fridge. The light clicked on, then off. The next morning, he didn't come to breakfast. Renee was gone before sunrise. I spent the day in the garden trimming back vines. By evening, the house was quiet enough to hear my own footsteps. That's when I changed the locks. By Monday afternoon, Weston had tried to access the home equity line. I knew because Laurel called to let me know he'd been denied. My name was still on the original title, and legally, I'd never relinquished financial control. That quiet line of protection, long forgotten by everyone else, was holding. Renee made her own move. She called the county office and requested a cancellation of the reversal proceedings. But the moment she mentioned the notary's name, the clerk flagged the file. The stamp had already triggered a review. Now it was a full investigation. Fraudulent notarization wasn't just a clerical error. By dusk, the energy in the house changed. I heard the suitcase being zipped, the closet doors opening and closing. Hangers scraped against the metal rod. I didn't go upstairs. I didn't offer help. Through the kitchen window, I watched as Renee dragged a rolling bag out to the driveway. Weston followed with 2 duffel bags. Neither of them spoke. The trunk closed with a thud that sounded more like finality than departure. They didn't knock on my door, didn't leave a note. Weston looked back once just as he opened the driver's side door. His eyes searched the front windows, but I stayed out of view. Then the engine started, and they drove off without a word. I waited until the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting the yard in amber. Then I pulled out the small lockbox from under the sink. Inside were the new keys already cut. Laurel had suggested it weeks ago, just in case. One by one, I changed every lock. The front, the back, even the one on the shed. I oiled each hinge, checked every latch. When I finished, I stood by the front door, holding the new key in my palm. It was quiet. Not the kind of silence that comes from holding your breath, but the kind that arrives after everyone else has left, and you realize you're still standing. The next morning, I walked to the mailbox. The official documents had arrived. The envelope was heavier than I expected. Laurel had sent it by courier, though she could have easily handed it to me in person. Inside the finalized reversal papers, the refiling receipt, and a letter confirming that the fraudulent deed had been voided. I ran my fingers across the new title, my name alone printed neatly across the top. No addendum, no joint ownership, no conditional language. Just what it should have been all along. Renee's name had been stripped from the account that once made her feel untouchable. The bank sent notice of the change. No contest, no appeal. Just a quiet update to the system, a line erased with the same quiet swiftness it was written in. Weston hadn't called. Not once since the day they left. I hadn't expected him to, but I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd want to explain something. Even if it was empty, even if it was late, but there was only silence. I set the papers on the dining table beside the folder that had grown thick over the past few weeks. Pages with signatures, maps of the land boundary the original deed Harold and I had signed 3 decades ago. I took my time reviewing each one, checking corners, refolding the creases. Then I brought the entire folder into the hallway closet. The fireproof safe sat behind the coats untouched since Harold passed. I turned the dial with careful fingers and opened the door. The papers slid into place beside the will and the trust documents. I closed the safe slowly and spun the lock, once listening for the final click. I didn't label anything. I didn't add a note. When it was done, I made tea and sat by the kitchen window. No victory dance, no message sent. Just the sound of branches brushing the side of the house and the soft hum of the kettle settling on the stove. In the distance, the sky was beginning to shift. I stood, opened the back door, and stepped out toward the garden. I started with the thyme. It had overgrown its little bed near the porch, choking itself out in dry patches. I dug out the roots, carefully cleared the soil, and replanted it beneath the kitchen window, where the morning light still touched soft. By midday, I'd moved on to the compost. The bin had sat, neglected, its lid warped from weather and time. I replaced the hinges, stirred the layers, and reset the frame so it no longer tilted. The scent of decay didn't bother me. It meant something was still turning into something else. The trellis near the shed had fallen in last winter's windstorm. I propped it upright, drove in new stakes, and rewound the grapevine that had survived the storm. My husband used to fuss over that vine, worried it wouldn't last another season, but it had. The garden shears were dull from neglect. I spent an hour at the bench, oiling the hinge, grinding the blades. It was the kind of work that didn't need music or company, just hands and memory. The house stayed quiet all day, but not the hollow kind of quiet it had known before. This was something cleaner, like air after rain. I ate dinner alone, salmon, steamed greens, a sliced pear from the tree out back. I didn't set the whole table. Just one place, one fork, one napkin, folded over my lap. The extra chairs had been stacked in the garage. I hadn't meant to move them, but one day I did, and they didn't need to come back. I poured myself a glass of water and sat by the kitchen window, watching the last bit of light slip behind the trees. The thyme looked small, but steady in its new spot. Some things I'd realized weren't meant to be shared until they'd grown roots again. I washed the dishes slowly, dried them one by one, and placed each back in its place. Then I turned out the light and walked down the hall, past the empty guest room, toward the study I had nearly forgotten was still mine. I scraped the last layer of taupe paint off the far wall myself. Underneath, the old pale green showed through, faint but familiar. I didn't bother repainting. It didn't need to be perfect, only honest. The room had been theirs briefly, then a spare space for my quiet exile. Now, it was mine again. I pulled the old bookshelf from the garage and wiped off the dust. One by one, I unpacked the boxes they'd labeled for storage, my novels. Harold's gardening books, the poetry volumes I used to keep beside the bed. The shelf filled slowly, unevenly. Some spines cracked from time, others still stiff like they'd never been read. I liked the mix. Harold's chair went by the window. It still held the curve of his back in the worn upholstery. I sat in it for a long time that first morning, a mug of coffee in my hands, the silence not just allowed, but welcomed. The room didn't need to prove anything now. It didn't apologize for itself. And neither did I. Outside, the gravel drive curved like a question. No one had pulled into it since the day they left. The mailbox still bore the same name it always had, A. Lane. I hadn't repainted the letters. I hadn't needed to. I opened the front door and let the air move through the house. It smelled like soil and wood and whatever I'd simmered the night before. There were no visitors coming today, no birthdays to plan, no phone calls to expect. Just a stretch of open day, wide and still. I poured another cup of coffee and walked out barefoot, letting the screen door ease shut behind me. The porch boards creaked as I stepped to the edge, looking out over the field that once held wildflowers and children's footprints. It still held me, and I held the deed.